And we will get started. So welcome everyone. I'd like to welcome you to today's Info2Go. Today's session is all about grants. So we'll start by having some general overview of grant writing and grant administration, and then we will follow with some ICfL grants for those of you that are joining us from a library within Idaho that might be of great interest to you to consider applying for. So this event is brought to you by the Idaho Commission for Libraries with funding support through the Institute of Museum and Library Services. Today's session is being recorded. We'll make this recording available on our website in the Info2Go archives. We will also push you the link if you registered ahead for this webinar. My name is Tammy Hollyhouse, and I'll be your host today. And I also wanted to introduce you to Annie, our CE consultant. I think she's hanging out with Christina. Smile and wave, Annie. She's our new and improved continuing education consultant. So she will be taking the reins for further Info2Go sessions. Lastly, I would like to welcome our guest presenters today. We have from the Idaho Commission for Libraries, Christina Taylor, Jamie Mott, Jeannie Standel, and Randy Kemp. So I will turn it over to you. Christina, you're still muted. There you go.
Okay, I'm good now.
Oh yeah, one thing I'll mention, the attendees, you are all muted. Feel free to type your questions in the chat box, and we will all be monitoring those and get those answered for you as quick as possible. Christina?
Okay, thanks. Thanks for joining us today. So we are attempting to meet a couple of needs with one webinar, which we've been getting requests for some tips and information and resources for grant writing, as well as some specifics on ICfL grant opportunities that are open now and some additional resources on that end. So we're hoping to marry the two and get a little bit of information to everybody. So to start, we were going to have a little poll just to see who we have on the call or on the webinar, and just to get an idea of where we should spend our time and energy. So we have a quick 2-question poll. If you guys could take a minute to tell us a little bit about your grant writing experience in general, and specifically with ICfL grants, and I'll give you a minute to fill out that poll. About even. Can you scroll down? Okay, so I can't see the results, but Annie's showing me, Tammy, it looks like most people have answered. She's muted, isn't she?
Sorry, I was muted. Yeah, I haven't seen the percentages change, so shall I go ahead and make those viewable?
Yes, I think so.
All right, can everyone see those?
Yes. Great, so in terms of grant writing experience, a little heavier on the experience, but pretty even overall. And on ICfL grants, pretty heavy on the people who have submitted 1 or 2 grants, but looks like also fairly even, so that's good. I think then we'll have some good information for everybody today. So we'll go ahead and close that poll and get started. I just have a quick little, hopefully a little slightly inspirational slide here to remind everyone of why we're here. So often we work in libraries, but we didn't anticipate becoming a grant writer. So we know why we're here from the library end, and just sometimes it's helpful to keep that in sight as we're grinding through the grant writing applications and deadlines and reports. So if you need a little reminder, just read some of these quotes. So we're going to start, like we said, with a quick overview of some of the basic grant components. These 5 listed here are some of the most common components that you'll see in various types of grants, from small local community grants to larger federal grants in some fashion or form. The names might change a little bit, but if you have an understanding of these 5 areas and really are prepared for these 5 areas, you can pretty much tackle any grant application that comes your way. So beginning with community assessment, a lot of folks actually skip this step, and this is basically understanding how do you know that your community has a need or a gap in service, rather than jumping straight to the need statement and, hey, this is what we need to do. You need to take a second to focus on gathering the information and assessing your community before jumping to the next section. With the need statement, this is again demonstrating and packaging that need for the reader. And we're going to dive into all of these a little bit more, just as just a quick overview. The description, it sounds basic and straightforward, but this is where you tie the need into your narrative and tie the 2 together. Your budget is another way to tell your story in numbers, and it should match your narrative. Oftentimes those are not in sync. And that's an important step to take. And the evaluation, this is often an afterthought, and we want to stress that the evaluation should be well planned from the start, and it can include both qualitative and quantitative information. So we're going to now dive into each of these a little bit more. This is just another way to view those basic grant components spatially. For those of you who think in this way, this is more of a timeline to show as you move along the line of where these components come in. And I've also added in another one here underneath the need statement called elevator speech, which is sort of like a verbal version of your need statement, but it can also be a very powerful tool for getting your message to those unknown potential funders or community members as you are possibly riding in the elevator or walking down the street on the way to another meeting. You might have 1 to 2 minutes to express your need and your project plan in a very concise fashion, and this is where you can start crafting it and also use it in your grant applications, but also use it in your conversations. And we'll talk a little bit more about that too. Oh my. Sorry, 1 sec. It's not working. Having a little technical issue with my mouse here. Amy, do you want to talk for a second?
I always want to talk. But sometimes I wonder, what are words for? Can anybody name the artist of that song? What are words for? Is that the name of the song? Missing Persons. Wow, that was really quick. How'd you do that so quickly, Sydney? That was amazing. That was awesome. Very nice. All right. Okay, I'll be done now.
Okay, that's fine. Annie was also very quick in fixing my mouse once again, so hopefully we're all set now.
Perfect.
Okay, so the community assessment. This is, again, what I mentioned before, the very first step that should be looked at. And there are many different tools that a library and library staff can work on together to come to this information. Of course, the first is a formal community survey or assessment that can involve a lot of players and can take a while. Depends on the scope of your project if you need to go to the full community survey or assessment. But there might be pieces and parts of assessment that you might utilize and put into play to gather your information. Your own library strategic plan may have already done some of this work for you. They may have done an assessment when they were coming up with their own plan, so you might pull parts from that plan. Community interviews are a very powerful tool that you can choose to use and pick a few people that are pertinent to your issue and conduct interviews and then gather that information all in one place. Of course, there's your standard demographics and socioeconomic stats. And we do have a tool that actually we've created for the Kindergarten Readiness Assessment Challenge that has a lot of these links to demographics and stats pulled into one document, and that we have a link to that at the very end of the webinar. So make sure and check that out. It's also on our website. Of course, there's the gathering of informal and anecdotal stories that can come from your staff, that can come from your board, community members. It's sort of tied into the community interview. And then there's the actual, the data from your program that might tie in or lack of a program. And then you see, you know, what the numbers show you that therefore demonstrating the need for that program. It kind of depends on what you're trying to prove. And then there's also other organizations in your community who maybe have done this kind of assessment already, and you can gather their summer reports or their data and cite those. So these all become things that you can cite in your grant application if needed. Sometimes you might not cite it, but it forms your opinion of why there's a gap or a need for this service, and then you can just use it sparingly to prove the need for the service. Again, it depends a lot on the scope of your project. Okay, then the next step is taking all that information and turning it into a need statement, or also sometimes called a problem statement. Some folks don't like to call it a problem, but it's the same idea. And this is where I feel like if you have an elevator speech that tells somebody as you're walking what the event or activity is, for who, on what timeline, and with which partners, because why, in a brief few sentences, that can be the basis of your need statement. You don't have to do it in that form. You could write your need statement first and then develop your elevator speech afterwards out of that. Kind of just depends on what you're comfortable with and what you think you might use the most. But they're both important aspects of summarizing what you want to do and why. So you're telling someone with this, why is a project necessary? And it should ideally have two parts. It should have the statistics that support the need and paint the clear picture. And it should have something that ties in their emotions to make them compelled to fund you. So an emotional hook or story really tied to tie the stats in with the emotions. And the next section is often considered the bulk of your grant application, is the program narrative or project description. These can also have slightly different titles in the applications, but it's again the same idea. You are taking the opportunity. This is your chance to tell the funder all about your project from start to finish and give them a very clear picture of what you're going to do. This is where you want to really streamline your information and don't leave your funder guessing. For every time they read it, they shouldn't wonder, well, what about this? Well, they didn't talk about this. I wonder what they meant by that. You want to be very clear and you don't want to be repetitive. And this is where a reviewer, an outside reviewer of your work comes in handy, and we'll talk about that in a little bit too. But this section should also include a measurable goal or objective. So
let me step in. When you're getting to this point, a lot of your applications are going to be competitive grants. It's usually a pretty rare situation where you're stepping in and you're not competing against someone else for funds. So you really want to be very mindful when you're filling out your project description. You want to know who you're applying to, what are their goals and values, how does it align with what you're wanting to do, and you really want to read the question in full. What are they asking? What details do they want to know about your program? You don't want to leave anything out because, as Christina said, you know, especially if they don't know about libraries and you're using jargon or things they don't understand, if you're asking them to fill in gaps and then somebody else doesn't ask them to fill in those gaps, it makes it a whole lot easier for them to choose somebody else. So at this point, you're really wanting to make sure that you're looking at all the details. You don't want to skip over everything. So have somebody else with you. If you're asking them to proofread, don't just ask them to proofread your answer. Ask them to read the question first, give them some information about the grant itself so that they have some background, and that way they can give you really good feedback on whether or not you're maybe missing something before you just hit submit. Let's see, I think that
yeah, those are good points, and I just want to tack on to that a little bit more. For example, Jamie said address all the parts of the question. If it's like a 3-part question and one of them is who is your partner, and you say, oh, we're partnering with Head Start, local Head Start, and that's all you say, we see that kind of example a lot. What are they doing to partner? How are you partnering? What's their level of involvement? Have you met with them? And it shows if you have not met with your partner and you list them as a partner and you try to attempt to describe what you're going to do with them, but you've yet to plan that out with them, it shows in the writing, and that's, especially if that's a partnership that's required of the grant, that's a pretty important part to work out and demonstrate that you've been working with this partner for a while already. Okay, I think now I'm passing the torch to Jamie.
Yep. All right, so is your mouse not working again to advance? There we go. Okay, oh, back one. So the budget and financial plan is actually really important. One of the biggest things that I see when I'm looking at grants is when the numbers don't add up. So if the grant is saying pick up to $5,000 how much you would like, and you put $3,000, but then you only show me $2,700 in actual expenses, I start to wonder why you're asking for $3,000. You know, is their math just off? Are they not accounting for something? You really want to break it down into, as much as possible, what you're actually going to be doing. And this is where you really want to look at the grant to see what are allowable expenses, what are non-allowable expenses, because again, if it's competitive and we say, you know, this grant can only be used for materials, it can't be used for personnel. If you're then saying $500 for personnel, it shows that you haven't really looked at what you're allowed to do, and that's going to be something that where maybe someone else will beat out your application. So really break it down. I think we have one grant where we usually ask a question that we may have to work on the wording, but we say, what are you going to purchase with the money? Examples are STEM supplies. And then a lot of people just write STEM supplies. They don't write, we want to buy, you know, Mentos and Coke so that we can make a volcano, or something that gives a little more picture so that we get a better idea of what your program's going to do. So when it's really, really general, it's kind of hard to get that picture. So if you can break it down a little farther and say, we're going to spend $500 on books about STEM activities, and then, you know, $400 on this, $300 on a presenter, that gives a much better idea of your program. It shows us that you've really thought about it, you know what you want to do, and it just really works in your favor to really write that out and have it all add up. Okay, and was there a question? Oh, okay, yes. Yeah, we're going to talk about summer STEM in just a little bit. Okay. So evaluation, one of the things that funders want to know is, how are we going to know if this program succeeded? A lot of times, like last year, we did a pilot project. How are we going to know if we want to continue that? How are we going to know if we feel that it succeeded? So as you're starting to plan your program, you need to think about, what are the measures that are going to show me that this either worked or it didn't, or it needs to be tweaked before I do it again. Failure is not necessarily a bad thing if you can show that it's just something where you need to change the program. So evaluation is really a very important step. So what you want to do as you're thinking about this program is say, okay, here's what I hope to do. Here's what I hope my outcome is. How am I going to measure if that happens? So you can do that, as we said, either a qualitative or a quantitative way. Quantitative is obviously numbers. So I want to see that my checkouts improve by 20%. You can pull your numbers before the program, you can pull your numbers after and compare and see that number improvement. Or you can say, I want to have a qualitative change where you're talking more about behavior. So maybe there you're taking a program where you're teaching people how to use a certain software, and you want to see that they're more comfortable using it for themselves. You can tell that story in a different way. So you can either do it quantitatively, where you're saying 30% of program attendees were more comfortable, or you can have the personal story of this gentleman was trying to apply for a job. After taking the class, he was able to successfully fill out applications by himself. So you have those two different ways to measure, and they give kind of different data points where you have your numbers that show change, but you also have stories that show your behavioral changes that come from the program. And as I said before, failure is really not necessarily a bad thing as long as you can kind of come back around and say why it failed. So maybe you could say, you know, this didn't work, but it didn't work because our marketing didn't get out to the people that we wanted it to. So if we're going to do this program again, we really need to change the way we market, and then we think it'll be successful. So don't be afraid to tell your funder that something didn't work, because you obviously don't want to keep coming back and have it not work again. And I think most funders appreciate seeing, you know, especially when we're doing a pilot, we want to know, did it work, did it not? And if it didn't, what can we do to better support you? What can we do to change the program to better reach those goals? So evaluation is really very, very important, and good or bad feedback is all relevant.
Okay, thanks, Jamie. So just a couple of other tips, and you can use these or not. Grant writing, the process is sort of a very personal, you know, thing, and you guys have to find what works best for you. One thing that I like to do is create a boilerplate, also I call it a cheat sheet, of some of the basic components with a brief version of the answer to each of those, so that especially as if I'm writing multiple grants for one program, and I know I'm going to have to apply to 4 different places to hopefully get enough funding, then I'm going to use that same material over and over again and repackage it slightly differently for the different funder. I create a cheat sheet, a boilerplate that I pull off of when I'm starting fresh with a new grant. I've got my need statement, I've got my mission, I've got my budget summary, things like that. And then it's just a lot easier for me to tackle a new grant application. The other thing is I often will take the deadline of the grant application and break it out so that I'm working on one piece of it per day, so I don't get overwhelmed. And it's kind of not the funnest thing to do, to write a whole grant in one day. So I like to break it out and give myself, okay, I did this today, now I feel good about moving on to the next section. But again, it's up to each person what works best for you. Also, you definitely want to impose a self-imposed deadline prior to the true deadline. Things come up, you get behind, you're expecting someone else to help you on this part and they can't, or they can't review it. So anyhow, it's just nice to at least give yourself about 1 to 2 weeks before the real deadline as your self-imposed deadline. Also, it doesn't look great if you're sending your stuff in express overnight mail to get it there in time. It doesn't give the funder the most strongest vote of confidence that you're gonna be able to hit all your other marks if they fund you, if you're having trouble meeting the first deadline. We also suggest definitely proofing. If you live with a grant application and the text for a while, you don't see things after a while. You don't see incomplete sentences or things that run into each other. So just having 2 people proof, 1 person preferably that's familiar with the program so they can make sure that you're hitting all the right content, and then another person who's not familiar, because then they will see all the things that the other 2 of you have completely missed, to make sure it makes sense to the layman person as well. And then the last thing is just also put your deadlines. Once you get funded, put all of your report deadlines on your calendars and in multiple places, because there's nothing worse than having the funder call you saying your report's late. It feels bad on both ends. both sides of the story there. So you definitely want to get your reports in on time, and even if they don't require a report, it's nice to send in a thank you, an official report, photos, news clippings, anything to further that relationship with that funder, because you never know when you're actually going to continue that funding, that relationship with that funder and continue on the next year. Or maybe it's an annual grant that you can apply for, and they then you've proven your responsibility to them, and they're going to be that much more likely to fund you again. Okay, we're almost done here. I'm going to pass it back to Jamie.
Sorry, I keep clicking on the mute by my picture, and that's not the one that works. So we're just going to give, again, a quick overview. And these are a lot from things we've seen for people who apply to ICfL grants. So some real quick do's. Like I said, read every single instruction, read all the information, don't skim because you might miss something somewhere that's important and that will lose you points on the application or get you not funded. Be as clear and concise as possible. Answer the asked question. You know, sometimes we have 3 or 4 questions that might be somewhat similar, and people throw stuff kind of everywhere, and then we're looking through 3 or 4 questions to try to find the answer to one question. So really read that question, be clear and concise in your answer. Sometimes if you're just running on and on and on, the reviewer just gets lost in all that text and trying to figure out what you're saying. Spell and grammar check always. It just makes it so much easier for the reviewer when everything makes sense and they're, again, not trying to guess what you meant. It also, when you're looking at a lot of applications, if one is really, really bad as far as a lot of errors, it can somewhat affect the way someone's reading your application because it looks like you didn't care enough to check it or take the time to do it versus someone who does have everything in order. Again, check your financials, make sure all the numbers add up, make sure you're not asking for unallowed items. Feel free to ask the funder questions. A lot of our grants here, we encourage people to call before they submit, ask us any questions they have. So take advantage of that, especially there's a lot of places where they'll do a review of your application before you actually submit. So like Christina said, give yourself a false deadline. Get that into them, let them give you feedback so that you have time to change, and that just increases your chances of being one of the selected applications. And yeah, like the last point I said, so yeah, if you can take advantage of that, there's no reason to not. Things to avoid: never, ever, ever assume that the reader knows anything about your project, anything about libraries. You know, we might be pulling in somebody that has never worked in a school library and the grants for school libraries. They just don't know. And we as consultants can try to fill them in, but you making your application clear really helps. Never use jargon or acronyms without a definition. So if I'm writing an application and I say IMLS, someone may not know what that means, but if I say Institute of Museum and Library Services and then put IMLS in parentheses, then later I can reuse it and they'll at least be able to refer back to what I was talking to so that they know what it is. And lastly, don't equate a long answer with a good answer. Just because you're writing a lot and putting a lot of words, that doesn't mean that you're going to get more points, that it's going to be better. Really be selective in what you say, read through, make sure it makes sense, make sure that somebody's going to understand what you're trying to ask for funds to do. And Christina, anything else you want to add for do's, don'ts?
You mentioned points. That is something to keep in mind. Just sometimes the grant has points associated with certain questions, and so there's a scoring rubric behind the application that the reviewers are going to use to score. So if that's happening, the points should have the question should have the points associated with them. So just pay attention to that if that's the case. Not all of them are that way, but and then we go ahead,
couple
Tammy.
things. Tanya asked if the slides would be available later, and those will also be posted on our website, so don't worry about that. You can access this later. And Fiona has a veteran tip that she would like to share. She says that ICfL will help you make your application better if you ask them to. So one of the things that ICfL program leaders can do is review your application well before it's due.
Definitely. Thank you, Fiona.
One last thing, Alice had her hand up for a minute. I don't know, Alice, if you have a question, go ahead and put it in the chat box. It may have just been a mouse issue as well.
Okay, this slide and the next slide are actually grant resources, which we're going to be pushing these out at the end with a survey so that you can have the actual links, or you can get the slides later. And yes, Alice, so she asked, is it okay to use an abbreviation after you use it once to write it out in the grant? Yes. So I generally, yes, that's good, but if the application is several pages long, if it's been a while since I used the wording, I try to reuse it, you know, if it's been 5 sections, just so that the person doesn't have to keep going way, way, way back up. But in general, like for ICfL applications, if you use it once at the top, then that's usually enough. All right.
Oh.
You want to go to the next page?
Oh, okay.
Sources, and then I think after that was a slide for questions anyway. So if anyone else has questions up to this point.
And this is, I just wanted to point out this at the last link down at the bottom is the Kindergarten Readiness Challenge, the toolkit that I referenced earlier that has lots of the statistical demographics, locations and sources in Idaho and federally, all pushed into one document, and that is on the Read to Me page, resource pages of our website. And it's a PDF that has interactive links on it, and you can actually, it'll take you through a community assessment focused on kindergarten readiness, but it gives you an idea of basically what a community assessment might look like, and then you can tweak it if you're not focusing in on kindergarten readiness, you could tweak it, but some of those sources will be helpful for other programs as well. Okay, I think we're going to move on to questions if there were any other ones besides the ones. And Tammy will continue to monitor the chat as well, so if we'll go ahead and move on. I think we're back to Jamie, and she's going to overview what we're going to touch base on next.
First, we did have a question. So yes. Elizabeth is asking, do you have any suggestions on which grants to look at for a middle school? I see a lot of elementary ones, but no middle school. And yes, that is a huge problem. A lot of people tend to focus on the early years. What I would do in that situation is look for the grants where they're more open-ended. So the Idaho Community Foundation, for example, has their regional grants where they're open to any idea within certain categories. So they're not limited to, you must be a, you know, K-2 school. So whenever you can find those ones where you have more freedom in the project you're proposing, I think that works a lot better. But yes, sadly, middle school kind of falls into that not quite as served area when it comes to grants. Also,
Jeannie Standall, our school library consultant, might have some more information on that later today, this morning. But also a lot of times the community bank grants, the different banks that are in your community, will often have broader scope in their funding. I know Wells Fargo and oh, there's the names are escaping me, but almost every bank in Boise has some sort of community fund. Sometimes they're focused in on a certain topic, but oftentimes they're broader. So you might look at that. It's almost more like a sponsorship situation, but they call them grants still. So, okay.
Okay. So I'll keep going, and if you guys have questions, just put them in the box, and we'll go from there. But what we're going to try to do, we have several of our consultants on today, and we're going to try to give a real brief overview We have a lot of our grants open right now for application. So we'll give a brief overview of the program, what you can do with it, what we're looking for, deadlines, and then you'll be able to ask questions after each section of the consultant so that hopefully you can apply and get some money to do great things for your library. So first, Jen couldn't be on today. I don't think she ended up joining us. Did she get back off? I can't see the whole list up here. Okay. All right, so I'm going to be talking about summer STEM grants. So these went live January 1st, and you can apply through February 15th. And what we're doing this year, it's $500. We're doing them as a first come, first serve until we run out of money. So as long as you meet requirements, you will get funding as long as we have the money. And basically, if you are able to submit the application and you're able to answer the question on what you're going to use grant funds for, and you don't list something that you're not allowed to do, it's pretty much a given that you're going to pass. So the goal of this grant is to increase access to engaging STEM activities during the summer months. So you can use funds for bringing in presenters to the library, STEM activities, STEM supplies, books, all kinds of things, pretty much everything except for buying food for feeding the kids while they're there, or construction at your library. Those, obviously $500 isn't going to go that far, but those aren't allowed. But if you're wanting to buy, you know, books, little robots, things for coding, makeys, anything that can be related to STEM, if you can write it into the application and explain what you're going to do, we're pretty much all for you guys having the freedom to come up with creative things and work with the kids. So like I said, you're going to apply by February 15th. As soon as you get the application in on February 15th, we're going to start turning around and awarding funds and rolling the money out so that hopefully you have it well before summer so that you can buy your supplies and get going. So the timeline would be that you would do your summer programming May 1st through August 1st. Your report would be due September 15th. And basically the goal is that you will do at least 5 activities, hopefully if you can, outside of the library. The goal, I believe, is to have at least 40% of the activities happen outside of the library. But if for some reason you can't do that, in the past we have made exceptions. I think we had a library where they were using their meeting room to bring the food service for the summer lunch program into the library. And we made the decision that that would be a really good use of funds. So apply and talk to us beforehand. If you have questions, you can contact Jennifer Redford or myself with any questions. And here Christina has put up some pictures from prior year's activities. So does anyone have questions on the summer STEM grant? Looks like we have a question just on general grants where they're saying we have, I'm not sure how to say this, Hakwa Bank locally that has available funding, but the library must be a 501c3. Yeah, when you run into grants that require you to be a 501c3, a lot of libraries do not apply. You usually have to have a friends group or a foundation that is a 501c3 in order to apply for those funds. Depending on the grant, you can talk to the funder and see, sometimes they make exceptions for public bodies. So you could see if that would be something that they'd be able to do, but if they're strict that it's a 501c3 only, if you're not a 501c3, you just can't apply for those.
I will say though, if you have a strong community partner that you're working with for that program and the partner is 501c3, they could be the applicant and the fiscal agent. So you could consider working it that way if possible.
Okay, seeing no questions on that, I'll hand it over to Randy to talk about his summer intern grant.
Thank you, Jamie. Greetings, everyone. Randy Kemp here at the Commission for Libraries. The summer intern grant we piloted last year as an opportunity to increase the workforce in libraries. If any of you are desiring and needing additional folks on your team, wondering where they're going to come from in the future. And this is an opportunity to expose a young person, and we're defining young person pretty broadly here, late high school, 20-something, exploring a career, get them into the library, expose them to multiple aspects of working in a library, expose them also to a project with a community member that attends to some shared community need. So working with a partner, maybe it's a school or a child care provider or an educational facility, some other kind of educational opportunity in town, an employer, something where there's a connection to the needs of the community, as Christina was talking about up front, of understanding what's going on in the community to meet that need. So a project-based, summer-long internship with $1,000. So it is a competitive application process. The applications are due at the end of February 26th. And the application includes information about your community, the existing partnerships that the library already has, how the intern will be mentored throughout the course of the project and evaluated, what opportunities there are to really expose that individual to what it means to work in a library. And the commission on our end, again, $1,000, as well as support in designing the application, has already been mentioned. I'd be happy to help you work through that process, designing how the mentoring will go throughout the course of the summer, designing any kind of evaluation for the intern, how the mentor and the project partner work together. We at the commission want to be partners in developing all of that. There's my contact info for sure, just to reach out with any questions. We have up to 10 grants available for this opportunity for this summer. And there's a few pictures from 3 of the interns from last summer, just showing them in their work environment. So if there's any questions about this grant now, let me know. Otherwise, send me an email or call me. I'm happy to answer those questions.
Okay, seeing no questions at this moment, I'm going to talk a little bit about a new grant that is replacing, for now, the DIA microgrants. We've been doing DIA for about 15 years, and it was only a grant for 1 year, but we're moving that to a slightly different focus, and we're calling it the Underserved Children Welcoming Libraries Grant. And it basically focuses on equity, diversity, and inclusion aspects within the library to better serve all the groups of children that a library is meant to serve. It focuses on some allowable activities around audits, like a collection diversity inclusion audit, where you're looking at your collection to make sure you have enough resources for all the different groups of children and representing themselves in the resources. Same with story time. It's a diversity and inclusion audit is another of the activities to make sure your story time is diverse and inclusive. You can look at your whole plan for the year and then rework it, and then use the funds from the grant to help buy some of those resources to make sure you have all those groups represented. Some of the other activities are professional development for your staff around diversity and inclusion, an analysis of how you promote your resources and make sure that they're not, that they are available and visible to the public to make sure they're getting used. And then also what some people are calling a kindness walk or a library diversity walk, to make sure that your library is your physical spaces are welcoming to people of all abilities. So those are some of the things that we are highlighting, and it's a different grant for us. You know, it's definitely a pilot year. We're trying out some new things. It's open now. It's also $500, and we have enough money for 14 libraries. This could be school and public libraries can apply. And it is open until the end of January. And we had to kind of compress our timeline a little bit because we wanted to make sure folks had time to implement the activities before summer reading craziness started. So it will be open until January 31st. Funding will hopefully come out pretty quickly to you by February 15th, and then grant activities can start March 1 to May 31st. The good thing about this one is that actually you don't need the grant funding really until the end. A lot of the work is actually just a lot of staff time and hard work that has to happen, and so hopefully this will incentivize that work, and then the funding can be used to purchase the materials. And there's lots more details on the program website there, and I'm happy to answer any questions now or another day. And I don't have any program photos yet because there aren't any. You could be the first one to submit a new program photo.
Christina, there's a question from Elizabeth.
Oh.
Does this have an age limit on the kids?
So this first year we're focusing on birth to 18. So it's pretty broad. In fact, some people talked about going as high as adult collections and things, resources, but we did limit it to children up to age 18. So sort of a middle ground. Yeah, I can't see the chat right now. So if you have questions, let me know. No problem.
Yep. Also, we'll give another minute here, but Fiona had chimed in before Christina started that their library, the Caldwell Public Library, had a really good experience with summer interns last year. So that's really great to hear, to have young folks be able to work in a library just to see how cool it is. I love the idea.
Okay, I'm going to pass on to Jamie here.
Okay, so the next grant we're going to talk about is our continuing education CE grants. There's 4 different types, and the first step for any of these grants is to do a grant consultation with our new CE consultant, Annie. So if you're thinking, as you hear about these, if you want to do any of them, the first step is to talk to her so that we can do that consultation. The first type is our funding for first-time conference grants, and you can get up to $900. The minimum is $250 to attend a conference that somehow relates to your work. And we try to take it pretty broadly. If you can make an argument to us on why a conference will relate to your library and your work, we really try to support that. So our main goal is to provide the opportunity for library staff to attend a regional or national library conference for the first time. So the conference needs to be 50 miles away from your library in order to qualify for the grant funds. But we're hoping that that helps with professional development for the need of the participant and your role in the library. So if you're in library marketing, a marketing conference might make more sense than something like PLA. So the timeline to apply is at least 30 days before the event, and the consultation has to happen before the application comes in. So if you apply and you haven't done the consultation, I'll usually refer you to Annie. You can request reimbursement. So it is a reimbursement grant, these all are, within 30 days after the event. And then there's a 6-month follow-up report for each of these. And I think I'm just going to go through all 4 and then take questions at the end on them, unless someone has a question along the way. Library science course grants, there is a lifetime maximum on these of $6,000 per person. Each individual award, so per school quarter or semester, whatever the school period is a max of $1,000. Again, a minimum of $250. So if you're looking at an online education course and it's only $150, we're not going to cover that. This grant does require matching funds. So if the total course cost is $1,000, you're required to match 25%. So that means that we would only cover $750. Again, it's a reimbursement grant, so you have to do the money up front, or the library has to do the money up front, and then we reimburse you afterwards. But the goal of this one is to support the achievement of a master's in library science or other library certification, which requires formal education. So it can't be used for non-library related courses. We have covered certain like the ALA support staff certification program and different things like that. So if you're interested in something, talk to Annie and we can certainly look at it and see if it would qualify. And this has, all 4 of these are going to have the same timeline as far as talking 30 days before, reimbursement 30 days after, and then the 6-month required report. So the next type is leadership development grants. A few years ago, they found there was a need for something that didn't quite fit into those library science course grant category. So this is the same amount of money, up to $1,000 with a 25% match required. But this supports a library employee to attend either a college level, university level leadership development activity. So basically, if you have someone and maybe that you want to move them into a management position, or put them in a role where they're going to need that leadership skill set, you can look at one of these type of programs, and we can possibly help send them to that. And again, if you're looking at something, get with Annie. And this one, I think we have a $3,000 lifetime maximum per person. And then our group training grants, again, there's a 25% match required, but this one goes from $500 up to $5,000. And the idea here is that you can have your library staff receive group training on a specific topic. So you can either bring in a trainer, or you can send a group out to a training. And I should say with these, with the first time conference, with this, your trustees are included in that group. So if you want to bring a training in and have your trustees attend something that could qualify, these, we only do 1 grant per library legal entity per year. So if you want to look at doing more than 1 event, you would need to partner with another library. So maybe library A applies for a training in the fall and they invite all the local libraries to participate. And then maybe library B does the other event later in the year and invites other libraries to participate. So you can do that partnership where one library is the grantee, but they invite other libraries to come, which we actually really encourage because the more training, the better. But each library only gets 1 per year. Okay, does anyone have any questions on continuing education grants that I can answer at this time? And I think if not, then we're going to be handing it over to Jeannie for school library access.
Hi everyone, it's Jeannie. I am the school library consultant here at ICfL, and so the grants that I'm going to talk about will be for schools for the most part. So the first one is the Elementary School Library Access Mini Grant, which is a mouthful, and so we call it the SLA Mini Grants. And there are 2 types. The first one is Round 1, and this one is for elementary schools, and I should say publicly funded elementary schools that have never received an SLA mini grant before. Schools can apply for grant funding in the amount of $1,000 to $5,000, depending on their capacity and how much they think they can manage. There are 3 goals for this grant, and the first one is to increase the amount of reading done in the homes of children in preschool, kindergarten, and 1st grade. The next is to increase the access to age-appropriate quality titles in the school library. And the third, of course, ultimately, is to increase the number of children reading on grade level. The application window for this grant is open right now, and the application window will close on April the 3rd. The mini grant is implemented in the school year following the year that you apply. So it's quite a long grant cycle, but you'll have plenty of time to implement the grant and hit all of those requirements for this grant. And the next one is the Round 2 grant. This one has the same goals as the Round 1 grant, with one additional goal in that we want to encourage school administration to actually fund the school library with a book budget. So there is a 25% grant for eligible elementary schools who apply for this Round 2 grant. Again, the funding amount is $1,000 to $5,000, and the application window is the same. One other requirement of this grant is that you cannot have received the Round 1 grant within the previous 3 years when you apply for this grant. So there's a 3-year gap between when you receive a Round 1 grant and when you can receive a Round 2 grant or apply for a Round 2 grant. And I think that those are the school library access grants in a nutshell. And these are some very cute photos of kids reading with books purchased, of course, from the School Library Access Mini Grant. And up next is the Idaho Lottery Bucks for Books program. And this grant program they like to call it an award program. So the awardees of this program are actually administering the first award right now. And next fall in September, you'll want to watch for information about next year's grant. And Elizabeth, keep your eye open for this one to open in the fall, because we think we're going to be able to include secondary schools in eligibility for this grant. So in answer to your question, we hope we've got something on deck for middle schools to be able to apply for. This grant can be applied. The awards are in the amounts of $1,000 to $3,000, so it's a little bit less than mini grants, and it is funded by the VIP members and the Idaho Lottery. So we are thrilled to have this partnership going on with the Idaho Lottery and the Bucks for Books grants. It's for your book budget. So these funds can be used to buy books, and there's a lot of freedom in the kinds of books that you buy with this grant and for the age groups that you buy them for. So it's just a really great boost to your book budget. So keep an eye out for that one again in September.
If there aren't any questions for Jeannie, there was actually a question in the chat back on the CE group grants, Jamie. I'm not sure if it went away.
Yeah.
Did you see the one about Washington attending?
Yes, and I responded to the chat. I don't know if they got that or if it was a
oh, okay.
Maybe. But so basically the question was, would partner libraries in Washington be able to attend a group training grant if an Idaho library applied? And my take on that is that, yes, that's perfectly fine. The Idaho Library is our grantee as long as they meet all the requirements. Who they invite to their program or who they open it up to is perfectly fine. So I'm great with other library staff, even if they're from another state, getting training. So as long as some Idaho library staff are the recipients of that, then that's fine with me. I don't know if Tammy or Annie would have another take, but I think IMLS is always a fan of spreading the wealth and sharing training and resources as much as possible.
I agree.
Well, that is the end of our grant marathon overview. We do have, we're almost right on time, but probably have a few minutes here if anyone has questions. I've also thrown up, again, all of our contact information and emails. I know there are a lot of different people, a lot of different grants, but we are always available to answer your phone calls, your emails, or your texts, or I don't Snapchat or all that stuff, but somebody probably does. So I guess we'll just see if there's anyone else that has any questions. Otherwise, we'll sign off and hopefully see lots of wonderful applications come flowing in the next few weeks, because it's a busy time. And that is one thing I want to mention. We are trying to be aware of when we time these grants, the open windows and the implementation windows, and we are continuing to work on improving that. If the Welcoming Libraries grant goes well, we'll probably move it to the fall. So the fall of 2020, it'll hopefully open up again, and then have a lengthier time to implement over the winter when things are quieter, and take it away from that busy springtime, because you know, the summer STEM pretty much has to stay where it's at. Summer intern has to stay where it's at, because of the timing of that work. So we are aware of it, but you know, we don't want to take any opportunities away from you that we can.
So Christina, there's a question from Elizabeth. Is there a way to make yourself more unique in your grant? Most libraries are underfunded and non-diverse in my area. Any suggestions on how to stand out better?
That's a good question, and I agree, especially when we look at those school library access grants. I've helped review those for several years. You look at them like, oh, yep, no book budget, oh, Title I, oh, rural, you know, a lot of them do have a lot of the same check marks. In my experience, one of the ways you can do that is to really focus on the story, the impact story. And the impact story can demonstrate the need, like we talked about, that emotional hook, but it can also show how much you've dived into the issue by working with your partners and having those community interviews and citing all of that legwork that you've done, and then the story to back it up. I think that will separate you, because a lot of people, if you see some of the grants we get in, they do answer the question, but oftentimes in a fairly basic way. And so anytime you can really paint a clear picture, show impact, and show personal stories, I think that will separate you, because it will just show how much more effort you've put in. And therefore the funder is going to be excited to fund you, because they know you're going to really put in the level of effort that they want to see. Jamie, do you have, or anyone else?
I think a lot of it depends on the type of grant you're applying for. But yeah, everything Christina said holds true. You've got to find some sort of hook, whether it's your story, whether it's what you're hoping for your outcomes, maybe a unique way to spin your program. But yeah, when we read, you know, obviously every library has old books. That really doesn't make you stand out, but the ones that kind of stand out for me are the ones where they really nail down the plan. So just having that extra little information, we want to buy, you know, these specific nonfiction areas because we've done, you know, reports and found that those are the ones that are the most needed. Even that sometimes is enough to just show that you've really done your research and help you stand out. If it's a really big grant, like if you're trying to go for some of the Knight Foundation, or I'm trying to think of the one that does the community work, then I think you've got to have more of a unique twist on a program, because with a lot of libraries applying, a lot of places are trying to do the same thing. So if you can come up with something that's really interesting or something special about your area where you can do it better than other places, that would be something that would stand out. So a lot of places are trying to do robotics programs, but maybe you have a way that you're going to do it differently. Maybe you have a unique partnership, just something that's a little extra. And there was also a question, I didn't see it in the main chat, for continuing education.
Good.
They were asking about Destiny training, and I was trying to look it up because I have to admit I'm not familiar with what Destiny is. I think it's possibly a
it's a catalog system in ILS.
Yeah, and so any of those questions, whenever you think there's something that you have a whole group of you that you would like to do, definitely bring it up, because we can talk about it here and make a decision and get back to you.
I noticed that Jeannie had her hand up a little while ago. I didn't know if she had anything she wanted to add.
I was just typing madly in the chat box to put this in, but for those of you who are applying for the school grants, bringing your statement back around to how you're supporting the student is an excellent way to distinguish your application from others. So how is your plan and how are these funds going to support your students? That's it.
Yeah, and quite frankly, a lot of times just really reading all the instructions and answering the questions fully and concisely is a good way to stand out, because we get a lot of applications where people don't fully answer everything. So being the one that, you know, really dots all the I's, crosses all the T's, it does make your application more appealing.
Any last questions? Christina had a good note to focus on the student, not the collection. I think always if we focus on the users, your grant's going to be a lot stronger.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, focus on the people, not the stuff. The stuff obviously is important to support the people, but in the end, we're about, you know, education and improving people's lives. So, and with that, I just wanted to say thank you for coming. And yes, the most important asset of the library does go home every night, you guys. So thank you for coming, and let us know if you have any questions and reach out to us another time.
Great.
Thanks
Thanks so
Tammy.
much to Christina, Jamie, Randy, and Jeannie.
And Annie.
And Annie, who's lurking back there under a different name. So we just appreciate all the work you did to bring this together. And as Christina said, thanks to all that you do out there in library land. We're here for you, so reach out. Thanks, everyone.